All right, take it away. Standing for Truth.
Okay, looks like we are live tonight. We've got an exciting stream for you guys. I've got David Neff here, no stranger. He's had a few debates here, a couple with myself, one with Brother Smokey. He's had two with Kent Hovind. He's got one tomorrow with Kent Hovind at this on this exact same topic. Radiometric dating. From my understanding, David, the title of your debate with Kent tomorrow is radiometric dating reliable?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So guys, check that out. What time is it at, David?
So we will be doing it around 7:30 Central Time. And what is going to be happening is we're actually going to be recording this on Zoom, and I will be uploading it into my channel immediately after the debate. So I should have it on my channel by midnight tomorrow night. And Kent Hovind, if you want to watch it on his channel, he usually has it up in a day or two afterwards. So I will definitely I always upload it immediately after the debate. So I am very much looking forward to that debate with Mr. Hovind.
Okay, awesome. Well, guys, check out that debate. I like the fact, David, that you are going to upload it right away because, like you said, Kent sometimes takes a day or two to post them to his channel, but that should be an exciting debate. I'm looking forward to it. This can be a practice round for you. I enjoy discussing this topic, especially after I think the last 4 or 5 debates I've had in the last couple of weeks has been more so on human evolution, universal common descent. So right. It's nice to have a change and to kind of hear your side, see if there's any questions or arguments that you have that I may not be able to answer, and give me a reason to, look into it, study. So this should be a good topic. A quick announcement though, tomorrow, I'm really excited because we have Paul Price, who's a speaker from CMI, Creation Ministries International. He's joining us. You can look on his channel under our CMI website. type in his name. You can see some of the articles he's written. He's written a really good one on fitness with Dr. Robert Carter. So he definitely knows his stuff. He's no stranger to these topics as well. So he's going to be here to debate Dr. Ron Garrett. We always love when Ron's on here. He always makes for a good debate and discussion. So they are going to be debating genetic entropy. So I'm really, really excited for that one, guys. Make sure you're there. It's going to be at 2 p.m. EST. We've got a pretty strict format for the debate. We got lots of cross-examination. It's going to be a lot of fun. So make sure you're there. We've got a couple more debates that we're just looking to confirm, hopefully within the next week. One really big one as well, but I don't want to say it until we've confirmed it. But those are the only announcements that come to mind at this moment. So if anything else comes to mind, I'll let you guys know. Shoot in some questions. I'll be watching the chat too. We're going to keep this really informal, respectful. We'll keep it equally timed, very civil discussion. I'm just going to give the floor to David. He can take as much time as he needs to make his points, make his arguments. Whatever time he takes, I'll just take equal time, and then we'll kind of go back from there. We'll throw it to David, take as much time as he wants, and we'll do that for however long until we get bored, and then we'll get some audience questions and answers. So make sure you're tagging me. Like I said, I'll be looking at the chat. David, thanks for being here again. Excited for your debate tomorrow with Kent, and excited for this discussion we're having right now. So take it away. Give yourself an intro if you want to plug your channel, plug what you're doing, or if you want to just get right into your introduction, or I should say opening statement. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much, Standing, for that introduction. So tomorrow night, I am debating Mr. Kent Hovind on the topic of radiometric dating. This will definitely be a very exciting debate. And as Standing said, this is going to be an informal chat. And actually, the PowerPoint that I'm working on is a rough draft. So this is not going to. So this is going to give you a little bit of a foretaste of what I'm actually going to be presenting tomorrow. And just to keep the suspense going, I'm only going to present part of the arguments that I have for Kent Hovind tomorrow. And so if you definitely want to check out that debate, that I have a lot of really powerful points in that topic. So let me just get started right away. First, go back to elementary school, just a quick review. And an atom is the basic fundamental part of the element. It is made up of the protons, neutrons, and electrons. And in the nucleus, you have the protons and the neutrons, and then you have the electrons orbiting around it. The atom is defined by the number of protons. And an isotope is when you have more neutrons in the nucleus. For example, carbon-12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons and 6 electrons, so 666, it's the devil's atom. And carbon-13 has 6 protons and 7 neutrons, and carbon-14 has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. And what is interesting is some of these isotopes are unstable, and because they are unstable, they undergo radioactive decay. And this is effectively what is going from a state of unstabilization to a state of stabilization. And so the parent element decays over time into the daughter element. And we can use that. And to understand what's happening, you have to understand the 4 fundamental forces of nature. You, of course, have gravity, which interacts with all particles with mass. You have the weak force, which actually governs particle decay. Electromagnetism, which acts between the electrically charged particles. And you have the strong force, which binds quarks together. So to just kind of dumb everything down, the thing is just completely unstable. And this is how we know that the decay rate has been constant over the past 4.6 billion plus years, because if it wasn't stable, you would be changing one of the 4 fundamental forces of nature. And in fact, and you would get significant lethal radioactive doses. And as the rate project actually from the ICR asks at the very end of the at the end of their paper was actually talking about the heat problem that happened, that must have happened if the radioactive radioactive decay was sped up so much. And that's basically what would happen. Nothing could possibly survive that. And there are actually several different types of decay. There's alpha decay, beta decay, gamma decay, positron decay, and electron capture. But what we're most interested in is alpha decay and beta decay. So how do we test its reliability? Well, we can do it by testing the nates of methods on known ages. We can cross-check it with other dating methods, and you can send a sample to multiple independent labs, and if the independent team of scientists come up with the same results, that is good indication that the result is accurate. Carbon-14 dating is a dating method for determining the ages of objects containing organic material by using the properties of carbon-14, which is a naturally occurring isotope of carbon. Living organisms have the same ratio of carbon-14 that is in the atmosphere. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,700 plus or minus 40 years. Thus, if we find an object that contains half the ratio of carbon-14, we can reasonably conclude that the object is 5,700 years old. And this is best used on samples that are less than 50,000 years old, because anything that is older would have such a minuscule level of carbon-14 in it. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain over 900 different manuscripts, and carbon-14 analysis shows that they were created between 2,000 and 2,400 years ago. So right up in the centuries before Jesus, during the time of Jesus, and a little bit after Jesus as well. The Great Isaiah Scroll is actually dated to about 2141 plus or minus 32. So 351 BC, basically, in that section there. King Richard III, when his remains are found on February 4th, 2013, they took the samples to be carbon dated. The SUERC results showed a 95% probability that the bone samples dated from around AD 1430 to 1460, and over in Oxford, the results both came out around 1412 to 1499, again with a 95% confidence, which is pretty good considering that Richard III died in 1485. Allowing for this factor and bearing in mind that the results cannot be later than 1538, a Bayesian statistic modeling technique gave the approximate date at AD 1475 to 1530 with a 69% confidence, and DNA testing later confirmed that the remains were actually that of Richard III. And then Mount Vesuvius eruption, they used argon dating method to actually see if they could actually use this method on very young samples, and what they found was cyanide from the previously collected at the Cassi Amonti and Pompeii and Villa Pompeia and Plantes yielded a weighted means of 40 argon, 39 argon, age of 1925 plus or minus 66 years in 2004 from an incremental heating experiment of 8 aliquots of cyanidine. This is the calendar age of the eruption. Our results together with this work demonstrates the validity of argon method to reconstruct the recent eruptive history of young active volcanoes. So in conclusion, by using radiometric dating, we can get a reliable date for the ages of materials and consequently the age of the Earth. Radiometric dating of meteorites give the age of approximately 4.6 billion years old, diametrically contradicting the Genesis account. If radiometric dating was unreliable, then the results that I presented, that I know Standing would agree with, would be nonsense. So thank you very much.
Okay, David, looks like just on about the 8-minute mark. Very good. Thank you for the visuals. Good points. I don't think I'll need the full 8 minutes, but I'll start it now just in case. You never know, 8 minutes seems to go by pretty fast. So let's see, a couple things that I wrote down. Actually, I wrote down quite a bit. let's see. So I agree with your definition on atoms, of course. I have no issues with your explanation on how radioisotope dating works. Carbon-14, is it reliable? Is it consistent with a young Earth or an old Earth? Dates from volcanic eruptions. Right off the bat, something that comes to mind is carbon dating is fairly consistent with dates in the thousands of years, of course, but when you get closer to the flood, it shoots up. It's a little more inaccurate because of the effects of the flood itself, as well as worldwide volcanism and just extra radiation from the flood itself. That would boost both carbon right after the flood, creating lots of new radioactive material. So with your definition on atoms, like I said, I agree, as well as your explanation for radioisotope dating is dated too, and you showed a few examples of this. On igneous rocks, these are obviously rocks from when hot molten material cools and solidifies. The radioisotope dating clock starts when the rock cools. So once the rock cools, it is now assumed that no more atoms can escape, and any daughter element found in a rock will be the result of radioactive decay. Now, the dating process, as you covered here, David, then requires measuring how much daughter element is in a rock sample and knowing the decay rate. Now, here's where the assumptions come into play. So the assumptions with radioisotope dating, including isochron dating, the assumptions actually oftentimes are unknowable. A few of them being initial conditions, constancy of rate, and a closed system. Isochron dating, which they oftentimes will purport as the irrefutable dating method because it gets rid of some of those assumptions. Conspiracy Cats and I debated that one heavily. So you can check out that debate, and we'll talk about that here. When it comes to the actual radiocarbon influx, though, evolutionists, and I think you proved this here in your opening, they assume that it's been the same radiocarbon influx for the entire history of the Earth. Now, the problem is that carbon-14 is produced in the atmosphere, okay? This is as a result of cosmic ray bombardment of the atmosphere. Now, here's the thing. If you have a stronger magnetic field, as we would propose based on the pre-flood world and the biblical creation model, this would have been the case in the past. As we know, the magnetic field is decaying. This would be evidence, this type of evidence, as we know, the field itself protects cosmic radiation. Then radiocarbon production would have been less in the past, of course. When it comes to carbon, I mean, we can go through over a whole number of things that show why it's consistent with a young Earth. For the fact that diamonds are made up of carbon and have radiocarbon in them. We know diamonds are formed deep inside the Earth, of course. It's the hardest substance on the planet, so it can't be contaminated internally or externally due to the hardness of the diamond itself, of the substance itself. So the carbon-14, I think David would even have to agree, has to be intrinsic to the diamonds itself. It could not have come from the atmosphere, of course. You know what? Let me share a screen here on just one thing that I find to be fascinating, and I think a fatal blow actually to radiocarbon dating. Okay, so when you can see my screen, just let me know. And can you see my screen there, David?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Regarding the assumption, so here's from PhD in nuclear physics. Of the 8 assumptions, none can be considered to rigorously hold in all situations. This includes the isochron method. Therefore, dating by this method is at best a hypothesis concerning the age of any rock, suite, or mineral. It is certainly not a scientific fact. Now, here's a chart that's very important that I think really gets to the heart of this question. Now, your debate tomorrow with Hovind is titled, "Is radioisotope dating reliable?" I'll answer that question for you right now, no. Simply based on this chart, okay? Hopefully the audience can see it. Now, here's the issue. Argon, okay, for example, is present in rocks of known age. Therefore, the assumption that the clock is zeroed out, okay, is totally violated. Because if we have argon present in rocks of known young age, that means that that assumption of zero argon in rocks of unknown age is unreliable and actually ridiculous. Why are we going to trust dates derived from rocks of unknown age when we, as you can see here, we get dates of rocks of known age that are completely off? So there's no reason why we should trust the dating methods if they can't even give us accurate dates for rocks of known age. So you can see here that many different eruptions that have occurred in known history, known age from historical or archaeological data, 200 years, 200 years, 200 years. The dates that come back are oftentimes in the millions, in the hundreds of thousands, as you can see here. Therefore, it's way off. It's not even close. Now, we're gonna get claims from the uniformitarian that, hey, listen, this rock here of unknown age, we didn't see the eruption, we didn't see the rock form, this is millions of years old. There's no reason for us to trust that claim when right here, this is the best way to trust the assumptions. Do rocks of unknown age do rocks of known age give accurate results? And we know that it doesn't. Another very important thing to consider, and let me see here, I've got, okay, just about 2 minutes left. I don't need a screen share here. One thing that comes to mind, though, is the direct data, which we're going to be focusing on dating methods here, but the direct evidence, for example, in genetics, the fact that we have all these mutations that are accumulating, which puts a shelf life on genomes, to me, this is the most convincing evidence of youth. Because the fact that organisms are still here today, even though we have fast mitochondrial DNA mutation rate clocks, we have accumulating mutations in the germ cell lines that are degenerating all these organisms, and yet we see a ton of stasis in the fossil record, to me is the best evidence of for one, a young genome, and two, a young creation. So if we do touch on that, we can see, what David's explanation is for the mutation accumulation problem. We've also discussed in great detail the problem the evolutionists face when it comes to mitochondrial DNA clocks and Y chromosome clocks, which I believe, once again, direct evidence confirms a young creation, young genome. Now, the last thing I'll say, I've got 1 minute here. Dating methods are all unreliable for the reasons that I covered, but also due to accelerated decay. This assumption is what also destroys isochron dating, okay? So this results in relative ages and not absolute ages that David here is purporting. So if radioisotope decay was accelerated in the past, and I can't emphasize this enough, I've said this over and over again in debates, this would have obviously taken place during the Genesis flood. That means those radioisotope decay clocks that David here is looking to could never actually be relied upon when they date rocks of millions and billions of years old. And we actually have several independent lines of irrefutable evidence that accelerated nuclear decay has occurred. I'm going to save those lines of evidence for the next phase of this discussion, just to keep this equally timed. I'll cover those. There is a heat problem that results from it, but typically the heat problem comes after the uniformitarian agrees that, okay, these lines of evidence do seem to indicate damage in the rocks, and we'll get into them. Radio halos, fission tracks, helium, for example. We can touch on them in more detail in the next phase of this debate. But and as well as the result of catastrophic plate tectonics, subduction friction, runaway subduction, of course, this would wreak enough havoc in the rocks themselves to speed up decay. So once this is agreed upon, now we have the heat problem to deal with. And this is what the RATE project has emphasized. They've realized this. Then we can discuss solutions to the heat problem, but not until we can come to a common agreement that these mechanisms of the global flood could indeed accelerate nuclear decay. We got to get past that part first. So boom, I just hit the 8-minute mark. Yeah, I think I addressed everything, but we'll touch on more things in great detail. David, take as much time as you need. And then if you have any clarifying questions, of course, don't be shy. And then I'll do the same thing. So go ahead, David.
All right, sure. Thank you, Standing, for that interesting opening introduction. And once again, welcome to all of our live viewers. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to address the carbon-14 in diamonds. Diamonds are not dated for carbon-14 for a very good reason. They are not organic and don't get carbon from the atmosphere. Second, carbon-14 is only good for dating samples up to 50,000 years old. Any samples that are older than that would have so little carbon left that would be beyond the standard readable zone. In Dr. Snelling's paper, all of the diamonds were dated to be well older than 50,000 years old. In other words, the amount of carbon-14 in these diamonds is very minuscule and is very probably caused by background noise, background radiation, and possibly the decay of uranium nearby. So no problem with that at all. Second, I do want to talk about the heat problem and how exactly does a global flood radically alter one of the 4 fundamental forces of nature. I would like to see Standing try to answer that. And also, we have dated space rocks. We dated moon rocks, and we even dated samples from Mars, all of which show no evidence of accelerated decay. So, excuse me, if this accelerated decay did happen on Earth, how was it? How did it happen on Mars and other places? If we were to take a sample from space, and if the young Earth creationism was true, we should get a date of around 6,500 years. So that I think will be a pretty good place to start the conversation.
Okay, awesome. Let me address a couple of those issues then. So the point about carbon is, whether it's in living material or not, it shouldn't last any more than, I don't know, we'll give you 100,000 years. But the fact is, scientists, and not just young Earth creation scientists, have shown that there exists carbon in not only diamonds, but even in strata that the uniformitarian scientists themselves have dated to tens of millions of years old. Therefore, even for the reasons that you've stated, okay, even if for sake of argument we've given you that, tens of millions of years old should have rid those samples of carbon long before. I mean, you can have 500,000 years, but tens of millions of years old. I mean, that's diamonds, for example, as we know, require very high pressure to form. Where's that pressure found? Deep inside the earth. Now, Dr. John Baumgartner, who's made very good testable predictions regarding the global flood model, which we can touch on, but he's also been part of the RATE project, radioisotopes in the age of the Earth. What he did, he's a geophysicist. He investigated carbon-14 in actually a large number of samples. I can't remember exactly how many, but it was a large number. In every single case, okay, the measured carbon-14 levels exceeded the lab's background detection limit, okay? Yes, you can have 50,000 years, 100,000 years, 500,000 years, but tens of millions of years, no. It's unrealistic, unfortunately. The explanations typically are just ad hoc, post hoc rationalization, because the testable prediction was not in print from the uniformitarians that, hey, we're going to find carbon in samples that are tens of millions of years old. He even found significant levels of carbon-14 in coal and fossilized wood. And once again, those locations, these were found dated according to the uniformitarians, I believe, to tens of millions of years old as well. We can touch on the heat problem in a second, but I do want to ask you about what I believe is a fatal blow to this. Now, we know, and you might have an answer to this, I think we touched on this before, but helium, for example, extremely slippery, okay? It should not last nearly as long as tens of millions of years old, of course. But yet we see in zircon crystals, now here's the thing. This was predicted by Dr. Russell Humphreys of the Rate Project, that if the Earth really is young and if accelerated nuclear decay had occurred in the past, we should find evidence in the rocks themselves. Not only him, but also Dr. Andrew Snelling, Dr. Steve Austin as well. And they've discovered radio halos, fission tracks, the helium though. So the helium, the fact that helium is found in zircon crystals of tens of millions of years old, billions of years old actually, still in the rocks themselves, when anybody, any uniformitarian science will agree that helium is incredibly slippery. The fact that it's still in those zircon crystals is strong confirmation of a young Earth and accelerated nuclear decay. So that would be the question that I would love to for you to ask. So here it is, and then we'll segue into you. Take as much time as you need, and you can address anything I said on the carbon too. But if you want to just write this down or keep this in memory, okay? So
yeah, sure.
in a nutshell, David, helium diffuses so rapidly, okay? And I want the audience to understand too, because sometimes this can get technical. So the helium itself diffuses so rapidly that all the helium should have leaked out in let's say less than 100,000 years. You can have 200,000 years if you want.
Okay,
why are these rocks still full of helium atoms when they're dated at billions of years old, according to the uniformitarians? Take your time, David. Go ahead.
Okay, what type of rocks are they? The helium decay from where?
Zircon crystals that are dated to, I think, billions of years old.
Okay, sure. And what is the other stuff that you mentioned as well? Just so I can write everything down.
Yes. Okay. So the other examples, let me see. What did I say? So coal, fossilized wood, fossils themselves, and diamonds. Diamonds have to be dated at about billions of years old, since they have to form deep inside the Earth, being the hardest substance.
Right. And
they need a lot of pressure to form.
I definitely think I touched on that a little bit. And of course, carbon-14 is also found deep inside the Earth as well.
Well, that's the problem. Is why is it? No, because it comes from the atmosphere. Deep inside the Earth, it should be well protected. Maybe you'll get minute amount, but the amounts that are found, that's the issue. There should not have been, even with contamination. It will give you a little bit of contamination, but the amount that is found, that's the inconsistency, not to mention the helium. The helium, to me, is the biggest issue for the uniformitarian. So what do you think, David? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Here's my thoughts. Can you send me the papers that you're citing? That way I can really dig deep into that. That'll be really good for when we have the full formal debate on this topic. How does that sound?
That sounds good. That's, to me, that's one of the best evidence, is the findings of the Rate Project.
Right. And you found and you talk about carbon-14 in fossil wood, and carbon-14 in some of the layers that are in millions of years old. Can you give me some examples of that, and maybe send me the papers on that you're citing?
Of course. I'll give you papers. From all the findings of the Rate Project. I will give you papers on the helium, as well as the fossilized wood, fossils, coal, diamonds. Actually, you know what? I was going to ask you another question, but I just don't want to bombard you. This has been a respectful conversation. Take as much time as you need, David, and address anything you feel like you can address, other than the stuff that I can send you after. And then I just don't want to bombard you with too much. So what are your thoughts? You know what? What are your thoughts on the chart that I showed, where all of these rocks formed of recent age, where we actually know when the volcano erupted? What are your thoughts on the fact that when those are dated, they're so inconsistent with the actual date the rocks themselves formed, which are oftentimes within the last couple hundred years?
So again, can you actually send me that slide as well, and the papers related to that, because that'll be pretty good. Also, what are your thoughts on the fact that we were able to argon date the Mount Vesuvius eruption to pretty much the exact time frame for which we know that it happened? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, which one was it, David?
The Mount as the Pompeii eruption, using the argon dating method.
Okay, so, and when did that date to?
That dated to 1925 plus or minus 66 years. Um, our results, together with the result, demonstrated the validity of the 40 argon, 39 argon to reconstruct recent eruptions of young active volcanoes. So it's basically within the decade of the events.
And how many? Wait, so Pompeii, right?
Yeah, this was the Mount Vesuvius eruption.
Right. But when did this eruption occur?
Like around 79 AD.
79 AD. How many years ago was that?
79 AD. That's a good question. Let me just 20 minus 79. That will be about 1941.
Okay, so 1941. Well, that's a lot. That's a lot younger than billions and billions of years old. So I'm not sure if that's
Yeah,
one
well,
of
that's
the best
the normal
examples.
argon. So at least you can concede. Can you at least concede that radiometric dating is reliable under certain conditions, such as with this, and such as with the Dead Sea Scrolls that I presented?
Right.
Would you at
Well,
least concede that those are reliable?
right. So on events like you just described, especially when they're corroborating it with, like, I imagine they know roughly when the event took place. There can be some to gather. Actually, what method was used for that one? Argon to
Argon.
argon.
Yeah.
Right. So it's one of those things where, like, the exception proves the rule. And with the chart, I think I gave, and this was just a few of them, 3, 6, 9, 10, where the known age from the historical or archaeological data, 200 years, 3,000 years, when it actually erupted, and they came back with dates of 160 million years, 2 billion years. Like, this is these numbers are way off. But some event that occurred less than 2,000 years ago, I can agree that because, like the point I made earlier, the dating methods and the dates derived, I don't actually dispute those dates because I realize that they are themselves relative. They're not absolute. Right. So the fact that there's so many changing conditions and there's so many assumptions, well, oftentimes you'll get a date, like you said, of 70 AD, whatever. And as well, you'll get dates of billions of years old. But the fact that it's relative, it means that it's not absolute. And so when we look at differentiating lines of evidence, like the helium, the radio, the carbon 14 that's found in all these different samples, those don't give us an exact date because these are all indirect lines of evidence. So those don't give us an exact date of the age of the Earth itself, but it at least gives us a window and it at least gives us a maximum age. So that's the thing. So the fact that we find carbon, we find helium in rocks and in samples that are supposed to be tens of millions of years old to billions of years, that at least gives us a maximum age that, okay, well, the Earth can't be any more than 50,000 years, or it can't be any more than 100,000 years. Then when we go to the direct evidence, like your molecular clock data, the Y chromosome, the mitochondrial DNA, then we can actually say, okay, this takes us back, because genetics is what's inherited sperm and egg, not a rock, right? This is what takes us back about 6,500 years. Okay, so that is the actual age. So the dating methods, the rocks themselves, they're just indirect lines of evidence. We can get some idea, I guess, some consistency, but for the most part, it's relative. What would be your thoughts on the? Like, would you? Because we can talk about the heat problem, but would you concede that your examples such as fission tracks, helium, radio halos, is indicative that nuclear decay has been accelerated in the past? David, I know I talked a lot there, therefore I'm going to mute myself. Say whatever you want.
Sure. So I guess let me answer that with a question, and it'll be good if you send me those papers. That way I can really look into them. That way when we do the real formal debate between us, that way I can have everything just ready with all of rest of your stuff, and then I'll be ready just to go through each of these points. I do want to talk, since we're talking about the heat problem and some of the stuff there. You seem to agree that when we date these samples, that they do appear for some reason to be billions of years old. And so when we take a look at space rocks, such as moon rocks and places like that, those places were not affected by Noah's flood, so they should not be subjected to accelerated decay. But yet what we find is quite interesting that when we actually do radiometric dating to get the 4.6 billion years of the age of the Earth, we're not actually dating Earth rocks, we're dating meteorites, and we're dating the moon rocks. none of which should be subjected to any contamination here on Earth. And so, how do you explain that from a global flood perspective? Take your time.
So from a global flood perspective, the dates we derive from moon rocks themselves, like are these moon rocks from the Earth themselves? Like are these meteorites? Are they asteroids? Are they like
So,
what?
hold on one second. Let me. Rocks. So, hold on.
Because
So,
I do need to point out that when the rate project went into went into their project and they made their testable predictions, they also concluded that there would be two major events in the history of the universe where radioisotope dating was accelerated. The first event would have been the rapid creation of the universe during the creation week, right? A supernatural week that we can't repeat, we can't observe. The other unrepeatable event was the flood. Okay, so these are the two moments where we can safely conclude, okay, the evidence we find on the planet, the evidence we find in the universe itself that suggests nuclear decay has been accelerated at some point in the past. These are the only two historical events where we can assume this occurred. Okay, it doesn't just occur every single day. Yeah, in the lab using heat and pressure, we can increase the dates by a little bit. We can speed up the decay by a little bit, but nothing compared to what's needed. So those are the only two events. Now the moon rocks, or say the Mars rocks, for example, they don't really matter because when all elements formed during the creation week, they then rapidly decay before they stabilized. So as I said, it's not just the flood event, it's the creation event as well. The flood is just one of the models that states accelerated nuclear decay happen on the Earth. But universal radioactive elements were obviously created by God during creation week. They also rapidly decay before they stabilize. And we've actually seen this in experiments that I can send you a new, what paper do I have? It's in one of our books. I can send you that paper that shows the experiments have proven this.
okay, yeah, I think I know.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think I know exactly what the paper you're citing, and I believe that was only about 1%, and that was through electron capture decay, correct? Is that the
Electron
paper?
capture. No, I believe this was the proton. No, I believe this was a different experiment.
Okay. No, okay, yeah, you can definitely send that to me because that'll be fascinating to listen to and to read. But so we have two events. So let's just say accelerated decay happened during both periods of time. So again, we should see we see a consistency between the space rocks and the Earth rocks. If it occurred during the flood, then there should not be a consistency. Um, any thoughts on that?
I know you're saying there's a hardcore consistency, but I doubt there's a consistency because even the uniformitarians, the ones that hold to deep time, the Earth was formed much later than the solar system, of course, and the universe itself. Therefore, that which we find on Mars, that which we find on the moon, I mean, what dates are we getting versus the rocks we get on Earth?
Right.
I believe. Oh, and by the way, the experiment I believe is the proton. This is what I thought. I just wanted to double check. It's the Proton 21 laboratories, and it was called solid state nuclear fusion. So from my understanding, with the experiments that have been done, no experiment has ever shown a new heavy element form and then slowly decay at a normal half-life. They quickly decay past the first half-lives before cooling and stabilizing. So yeah, but I asked you a question about the assumptions that you were saying with the Mars rocks and the moon rocks. Yeah, what are the dates versus the rocks themselves on the Earth? How consistent are we talking?
3.16 billion to 4.4 billion.
Okay,
So that, yeah.
Okay, so what are the ones on the Earth you said?
So what we're actually dating these samples and meteorites and on the moon rocks, those date to be between 3.16 and about 4.5 billion years old. So
right. Okay. So the consistency on on the Earth itself for the flood, for that event that experienced accelerated nuclear decay. Now, the best way I can explain is I'm going to go back to the rate scientist, and I'm going to show why the Earth itself has consistent ages. So what the rate scientist did, and I'll send you the chart, and I'll send you some the chart that I screen shared, and I will also send you some papers from the rate scientists themselves. So they took rock samples from the same rock layers, okay, David?
Yeah.
And what they did is they subjected them to the dating methods all at once. Now, what were the results? Okay, so the rate scientists themselves, they found different results. And for people who want to look it up, rate stands for radioisotopes and the age of the Earth. So they found different results for the different dating methods. And that even included isochron dating, fascinatingly enough. This means there's windows of error, of course, for every single dating method. Now, the next logical question would be, well, how could this be? Well, the best conclusion then is that decay rates, as I explained earlier, were faster in the past. This means if the decay rate has not been constant in the past, that means those clocks, as I said earlier, are only relative versus absolute. Now, we would expect some consistency, okay, based on the flood. We do still get the same or similar relative ages, like you said, David. Great point. I'm glad that you've done your research on it. Now, rocks down at the bottom of the geologic column give older dates for the most part than rocks at the top. Okay, I agree with this. Now, this is exactly, though, what we would expect based on the Genesis flood, and I'll tell you why. Rocks laid down early in the flood should give older ages than rocks at the top at the end of the flood, okay? The dates derived from dating methods then mean that they're relative and not absolute. During the breaking up of the fountains of the Great Deep, Walt Brown has a theory that can be tested where once these rocks that shot forth into the atmosphere, once they were able to reach escape velocity, and it is entirely possible as long as they reach escape velocity, they can be shot up into space, eventually come back down onto this planet, right, and create a crater. When we date those rocks, those same rocks were also subjected to accelerated nuclear decay on the planet due to catastrophic plate tectonics. So those would also show consistent ages with the flood itself. So that was a mouthful. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, sure. So how exactly does that work? The escape velocity is like what, 26,000 miles per hour, insane speeds, and I can't even comprehend how anything could possibly have survived such a catastrophic flood. How could the marine organisms have survived all this bombardment of meteorites, the significant moving of the Earth's crust to where the continents are today, and how could it? It's hard for me to wrap my brain about how anything could possibly survive.
Right, and you know what? Even when we argue against descent with modification, universal common ancestry, oftentimes, and you'll admit, right, David, sometimes creationists will say, and I'm guilty of it too. It's hard to comprehend that banana plants and whales are related. Or it's hard to believe that billions of years ago, this planet was dominated by single-celled like ancestors. And billions of years later, we got whales and apes and plants and humans and all the complexity. How is that possible? Well, the thing is, oftentimes we can't wrap our minds around things, especially sometimes within the young Earth creation model and oftentimes within the evolutionary model. But oftentimes that's also a bad way to argue for both sides. I'm not saying you're arguing bad, but I'm saying I think both sides are guilty of that. That's why it then comes down to testable predictions, okay? One testable prediction to show that the flood is valid, regardless of any objections to the flood, as well as the testable predictions made by the RAPE project regarding accelerated nuclear decay. And I do want to answer your question about the heat problem, okay? But I just want to point out the fact that, listen, there is evidence for accelerated nuclear decay. Therefore, and the mechanisms like catastrophic plate tectonics, meters per second plate movement, not the snail pace movement that we see today, can wreak enough havoc in the rocks themselves. So we have the plausible mechanisms, and we also have the evidence in the rocks and the testable predictions. Yeah. One of the predictions, though, of catastrophic plate tectonics that Dr. John Baumgartner, and I'll send you this article and paper too, he made this, okay? He's a geophysicist. He said, okay, if if the flood really did happen and our model of catastrophic plate tectonics is true, and if plates are being pushed down, okay, like we would say based on runaway subduction, well, that means they haven't had time to melt, okay? Now, we have a field of science that you might be familiar with called seismic tomography. And we've actually learned after the prediction was made that massive cold slabs of rock have been discovered. Okay. They've discovered these at the base of the mantle. Now that means, okay, according to our model, it's consistent because they haven't been pushed down there long ago, because guess what? They have not yet melted. If they were pushed down there millions to billions of years ago, they obviously would have melted. I mean, the mantle is extremely hot. So point is, and the thing is, the evolutionists, uniformitarians, they may have rationalized this. I'm not against that, you know, but the thing is, it was a prediction that was made before the discovery itself. And that's why I always emphasize testable predictions. And then we've got the testable predictions from the RAPE project themselves that discovered the radio halos, the fission tracks, the helium. So yeah, oftentimes it's hard to comprehend some of the things that may have happened in our history, but it's the testable predictions that can flow from the model and flow from the explanation themselves. Are you familiar with that prediction? If not, I could just send you the paper. I don't want to bombard you, but are you familiar with that prediction by Dr. Baumgartner?
I am not. So if you could send that to me, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so do you know what, you probably know what radio halos are, helium, we've gone over that. Do you know what fission tracks are? That's typically the one that is the most technical to explain.
Yeah, I think I know what fishing tracks are. Those are like, let me see if I understand it correctly. Certain samples, when they harden, undergo kind of like fishing tracks caused by decay, I think. Or is that, or am I confusing that with something else?
David, you're on the right track. So the best way I can explain it for the audience, so fission, okay, it's where the uranium atom splits. It's what we get in a chain reaction that produces a nuclear explosion. Now, two halves of the atom fly apart, and we actually have a chemist in the chat, so if I explain it right, he could let me know. Now, if two halves of the atom fly apart, because they are so large, they damage the crystal. Now, we can see these tracks or trails actually where the particles have damaged the crystals themselves. So each atom that decays leaves one track. You count the number of tracks if you know how fast it splits apart, okay? Then you can calculate how old the rock was back to the time before the track started splitting apart. The amount of damage that we see in these crystals, not only based on the fission tracks that I talked about, but also the radio halos in such a short amount of time within the strata that even the uniformitarians would agree with, it's too much. You know, there must have been some kind of accelerated nuclear decay. So that's that specific one. Now, if you can at least admit that, okay, let's just say nuclear decay was accelerated. Your next question, I'm guessing, or objection would be a so-called heat problem. And David, I'm going to mute myself if you want, because I know we've been throwing a lot of things at each other. Is there anything you want to address before we get into like the possible solutions to a heat problem?
Yeah, sure. I really have nothing to address. Again, what you're saying is fascinating to me. Feel free to send me all the papers. That way, I think we're going to be doing this formal debate next week, correct?
Right. Well, what we'll do is it sounds like since your debate with Kent is tomorrow, you've probably prepped quite a bit for that. So but yeah, my arguments will oftentimes be different than Kent's. Like, I'm not sure if he's going to bring up the RAPE project. I'm not sure if he's going to bring up testable predictions. He might. I don't know.
He usually,
okay, go ahead, David. Sorry.
He usually doesn't get that technical. He usually talks about stuff that is so easy to debunk, such as wrong dates from living snails and mammoth dated to. I think he uses that. I know he uses Mount St. Helens arguments and a couple of other arguments as well. So but he never gets as technical as he does. He never gets anywhere near as technical as you.
Well, I guess my suggestion would be, since this has been a good discussion itself, you'll have your debate with Kent, then take a week or so to look up some of the RAPE project, look up catastrophic plate tectonics, for example, look up Dr. Walt Brown's model, because there's different models, okay? And you might have realized this in your research for your Kent debate. We've got Dr. Walt Brown, who suggests what's called the hydroplate model. We've got AIG, for example, the rate team. They purport a model catastrophic plate tectonics. I really like both models. I really like the catastrophic plate tectonics model because of the cold slabs that have been discovered. I really find that fascinating. That was an advocate of the CPT model that made that. Dr. Walt Brown's explanation for the so-called heat problem, and we've got a chemist in the chat, and he kind of explained it in a I'm going to give you the really technical article that talks about the solution to it. But according to Dr. Walt Brown's model, he says there is no heat problem that assumes massive decay, but because his model clearly shows these elements formed during the flood and did not exist prior to the flood. So that's his explanation. We've got a chemist in the chat who kind of purported that. But unless the article itself that goes over it is really, really technical. But I think we can even just use observable evidence today. And we've talked about this as well. We'll give your thoughts. Something that everybody can kind of just get something from instead of getting too technical. But the fact that the global flood itself, everybody would agree if it occurred. Actually, I wanted to clear something up before I even go into this. David, I found something you said fascinating. I think you said it to Smokey. Did you say that you believe there was some type of worldwide flood in the past? For some reason, I thought you said something like that.
No, so we were talking about the local flood. I do think that there were catastrophic local floods that the flood myths are based on. We see that, and I think what happens is that these legends begin to build up and become the dozens of different flood legends that we have today, and especially during the breakup of the last ice age, what it calls significant flooding all throughout the world, and so basically, there is definitely evidence of flooding, pretty significant flooding in the Middle East and in the ancient Near East, where the flood myth is supposed to have happened. So in that case, I do believe that is probably based on real events. I just don't believe it's a global flood where a 500-year-old man built an ark to save all the kinds of animals. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So based on the writings that we see around the earth, all the flood legends, of course, I mean, I think there's over like 850 of them. The global flood story in Genesis, you would at least agree that these are probably derived from that which was a real event. But you're saying it wasn't the global flood event itself. It could have just been, well, you said global flood events, but did you mean like a bunch of different local flood events that eventually got
Right.
embellished into one global flood event?
Right, exactly. And let me actually pull up some things. Let's see here. I think it's fascinating somewhere in the oceanic region, like in the Australian area. There's actually a flood legend. I think what I can't remember right off the top of my head, but there's a flood legend where there was a catastrophic flooding sent by one of the gods that drowned one of the islands. And what we found is that there is actually an island that was that matches the description. So I definitely think you can see how these flood myths can build into mythology. I had to dig it up, but yeah, does that make sense?
Yes. No, I understand your position and your thinking on that. My position would be that the sheer number of flood legends is pretty consistent with the fact that there must have been because oftentimes the stories, and yeah, they're embellished and they're passed down, after the flood, like I would say, they're oftentimes consisting of, somebody who's like Noah, something like the animals, like there's a lot of similarities, for example. But the fact that there's so many flood legends with all these similarities from people groups around the world who, according to evolution, never even really met and exchanged stories, but yet they're all so similar. That, to me, is strong confirmation that, okay, they've all must have, because according to our model, we believe in two bottlenecks after the flood. Well, we believe in three: the creation event, the flood, 8 people, Noah, his wife, the 3 founding couples, of course, and then the Babel. Let's say Babel had 10,000 people. Once they dispersed, I typically focus on genetics when it comes to the Babel dispersion, allele frequencies, Y chromosome variation, and how we can see traces of Babel in our genetics. But the legends themselves and the languages too, dragon legends as well, the fact that they're all spread worldwide on every single continent seems to be consistent. For us, we'd say, yeah, these people knew each other at the Tower of Babel. When they dispersed, they each took some stories, the stories with them. They took the genetics with them too, of course. And the sheer number of similarities in all the legends when it comes to the dragons of the flood, that's where I say it came from a common source, which was the global flood, which was passed down during the migration waves at Babel. So that would make sense to me. But for you, like, how would you explain that all the different people groups around the earth, that evolution would say, was there ever a bottleneck where they all knew each other and took the same stories? What would be your best parsimonious explanation for why is there so many similarities in the stories, though?
Yeah, well, for me, it's not the similarities, but there's the differences as well, and some of these differences are significant. Let me just take a look at a couple of them.
Yeah, go ahead.
In South Australia, a man's two wives ran away from him. He pursued them to the encounter bay, saw them at a distance, and angrily cried out for the waters to rise and drown them. A terrible flood washed over the hills that killed two women. The waters rose so high that a man named Nepeli, who lived at there, had to drag his canoe to the top of the hill. The dense part of the Milky Way shows his canoe floating in the sky. Let's see here. Papua New Guinea, people made the lizard angry by angries. Excuse me. The people made the lizards angry first by making a lot of noise and then by teasing them. Finally, the people incurred the wrath of the lizard man who caused it to rain for days, and the water rose. People climbed to the highest mountains, but still the rain came and the waters rose higher. People were drowning. Two brothers built a small raft and climbed aboard. Others tried to climb on with them, but the raft held only two. The two brothers floated off, and only they survived the flood. Some of these,
Right,
okay,
and even in those ones you read, I still found some slight similarities. But the whole point is that legends oftentimes become extremely embellished. Now, if we
Mike,
were to sit here and read over, go
can I
ahead,
ask?
David. Go ahead, interrupt.
Sure. So here's the obvious question: how do you know the Bible's version of the flood isn't embellished?
Good question. Good question. So the reason why, and we can actually take all. I'm just spitballing a number. I think it was about 800 or 850 flood legends. If we actually took them all here and spread them out in a room and read them all, and we had the Genesis account, believe it or not, the Genesis account, an atheist might laugh at this, but when it comes in terms of global floods and global flood stories, it's actually clearly the least embellished. I mean, the ones you just read about like Milky Way and lizards and, oftentimes the embellishments, you can tell what's embellished. For example, when it comes to dragon legends, I mean, eventually you get to the point where you've got a dragon legend where this dragon's got wings, he's breathing fire, he's indestructible.
Right.
Legends are just, look at the legends of your Greek mythological heroes. Hercules is now proposed as having Superman-like strength, when in fact there probably was a real person, such as Hercules, who is stronger than the average man, but nowhere near the embellishment that has been derived through mythology and years. And it might just be a worldview thing at this point, but I do find the Chinese one is incredibly similar.
And actually, I was just about to talk about the Chinese. The Chinese flood. Actually, legend says if China began in a great flood, scientists just found evidence that flood was real. So we see the flood myth. This is strong evidence from what I was saying that these small local floods that are catastrophic end up becoming embellished and mythologized over time. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I totally understand your position. My point would just be that it's kind of opposite of what you say. I'm saying that the similarities versus the differences, that's what I would focus on as being the result of a previous real event, the Genesis flood. And I think we can kind of see the embellishments and the differences, and we can compare side by side each story, and we can see, the one that looks the least embellished is that of which is in the Genesis flood. But I don't want this to be a flood legend debate. So let me just make a point real quick about Brother George Bond makes a good point in the chat about the heat. He says the heat produced by tectonic plate movement was over an entire year, not all on the first day. And we know water is a great heat sink. Look at your radiators. That's a comment he made. And then I'm going to give you plenty of time too. But what I was going to say is the fact that, and everybody can understand this one, the fact that massive amounts of water, given a global flood, even if you just put yourself into the position of a biblical creationist who accepts a global flood and then argues from there, that oftentimes that's a good way to argue. But the massive amounts of water that was on the earth at the time of the flood we should be able to logically conclude that a massive amount of water would have shielded Noah as well as the animals that were in the ark. Because you pointed out, hey, why didn't the animals all suffer from this heat and radiation? So if we have a mile, maybe 2 miles or more of water, and we've talked about this before, David, we know that we use a water in a nuclear reactor to protect and to shield things. So this would not only shield from radiation, but it would also take up much of the heat, which is kind of what Brother George was talking about. So, and then I would also go back to the super cooled hail that would have been assumed to have come down during the flood when the windows of heaven broke, when the windows of heaven were opened, of course. And then we've also got the fountains of the great deep. That would have cooled a lot of the heat. But the biggest thing, I think, given the fountains of the great deep portion of the Bible where it talks about the fountains of the great deep breaking open, that would have involved supersonic steam jets. And we actually have evidence that there is water underneath the rocks, right? That would have taken up most of the heat and then into space. And then space is like a vacuum. So that would have just absorbed most of the heat. So those are my explanations. Now, the Dr. Walt Brown explanation, the really highly technical one, I can send you that article and see if you want to read it and see if you can understand some of it. But what are your thoughts? I'm going to give you some of the final words here, David, just to address whatever you feel like you want to. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, sure. So I guess one of my biggest questions to you is what exactly are these windows of heaven? From what I understand and what other people have been able to deduce, the ancient view of the universe was that there were these windows of heaven and the firmament, the solid sky dome, and then there were oceans underneath this, the columns, the foundations of the earth. Of course, we know that is, of course, wrong. The question is actually, what exactly are these fountains of the great deep, just so I can get a better understanding, and what exactly is the windows of heaven?
Well, we can see the cracks all over the earth. So, for example, the fountains of the great deep itself is very interesting. So, as you know, you seem to be well up on your scripture, and I gathered that with your discussion with Smokey, which I really enjoyed. But for one, the scope and the scale of the energy produced by the flood would be astounding. Okay, this is an unrepeatable, unobservable event. Fountains of the great deep break open. Okay, the earth is fractured like an eggshell, and we can actually see this within the earth and the rocks itself. The continents are moving, we would say, vertically and horizontally at meters per second plate movements. But the water at the fountains of the great deep would have shot up like supersonic jets. Now, for this to be true, we've made a testable prediction that underneath actually, Dr. Walt Brown, I believe, made this prediction, but we have discovered underwater vents. Therefore, where's that water coming from? Obviously lower than the ocean floor, lower than the earth itself, right? So there is water trapped under there. We would say before the flood, there was a lot more water, and that the greater portion of the flood water actually came from within the earth itself that was there at the creation event, and boom, shoots up. And actually, that's where that prediction comes from with Dr. Baumgartner, where the pre-flood ocean crust is dragged down into the mantle called subduction process. That's where that cold slab prediction comes from. But that's the best way I can put it. The windows of heaven, some interpret as the canopy when it shattered and the water came down, and other people just say that was the massive amounts of rain that God or that came down during the flood. So there's a couple of different interpretations of that one, but it doesn't matter because I would say the vast portions of the flood water came from the earth itself anyway. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, definitely. And that is definitely something to research as well. Send me all those technical papers, and that'll be good prep So when we do our debate next week, I can have boom, answer after answer after answer for you. Um, so yeah. By the way, I'm thinking about bringing this up in my debate tomorrow about the cosmic microwave background radiation and like the distant Starlight problem and stuff like that. Just out of curiosity, how would you resolve that? Since we have,
Well, it's a good question. I mean, this could probably be an entire debate in and of itself.
oh, of course,
It would be like, in a nutshell, I would probably just explain it in the exact same way that, or more or less the exact same way that I explained it in our first debate when you brought it up. I think I addressed it in maybe my opening, actually, where I suggested the gravitational time dilation model, where God theoretically could have created stars and galaxies, while the model would suggest Earth itself would have been deep inside a gravitational well. And as we know this through Einstein, physics and science itself, that would cause Earth clocks to slow down. Actually, if the Earth is deep inside that well enough, time itself could stop. Then we look to Scripture, where it talks over and over again about God stretching out the heavens. Well, according to the gravitational time dilation model, God stretches out the heavens. Earth comes out of that well, and time starts ticking. This is after all your stars and galaxies would have come out of that well. So if the stars and galaxies, like I said, did not experience as much time dilation as the Earth, the universe itself could actually be relatively, the relative ages, the starlight, the space itself could look billions of years old, while the Earth itself is only one day, because Scripture is written in the perspective of Earth days, the Earth itself, of course. Now, also, Dr. Jason Lyle's model is really good too, which has to do with the one-way speed of light. We only know the speed of one direction. Therefore, the other direction could be instantaneous. And there's actually a lot of evidence for that. And
I have no idea what that means. Like,
yeah, well, it's highly technical. I can send you some articles on that and some paper on that. He actually, you might be interested in this one, David. He just debated Hugh Ross on this topic, and they actually discussed that model in great detail. If you know Hugh Ross, he's probably the number one guy. He's an astronomer. He's probably the number one guy to talk to on distant starlight. Yeah, and they had a really, really good debate on this, I think, like a couple of weeks ago on Jason Lyle's model.
Yeah, Hugh Ross, he's a old Earth creationist, right?
He is, but he's adamantly against young Earth creation, and he's written extensively on the distant starlight problem.
Definitely send me that debate. So obviously the question is, we have events such as supernovae and quasars and stuff like that from 13 billion light years away. From your perspective, when exactly did they happen? Because we have other examples, even within our own Milky Way galaxy, of things well beyond the 6,000 year light years. So when exactly did that happen? When exactly did those events happen?
So good question. So your supernova. So given first, I should ask you: are you familiar with the gravitational time dilation model that I talked about?
A little bit, but I haven't really researched it in depth. I know what you're saying, and but I definitely need to research it a little bit more in depth.
Okay, so good question then. So technically those events, a lot of those events that are found in deep space, like your supernovas or even just deeper in the solar system, because of the gravitational time, okay, the Earth being because we would have to assume that the Earth itself was created at or near the center of the galaxy itself. But if it's deep within that gravitational time okay, if it's the deepest, that means it's going to experience the most time dilation. So when God stretches out the universe, God stretched out the space, for example, because it's the space that's moving. It's not the stars themselves; it's the space in between. It's kind of like a balloon. If I put a lot,
exactly. And you would agree then that the universe, of course, is expanding, and it's still expanding today.
Right. So it's the space in between that's expanding. Sometimes a lot of people mess that up. If I were to have like a balloon that's not fully blown up and I just put a lot of marker dots on it and then I blew it up, well, obviously the dots themselves aren't expanding. It's the space in between them. So when God stretched out the heavens, well, your stars, that are the furthest away right now, your galaxies that are the furthest away right now, they would have been the first to come out of that time, while the Earth it starts off in the deepest point of the well, and it's kind of, you know what, picture like a trampoline. Take a bowling ball, toss the bowling ball in the middle of the trampoline. It would descend right to the ground. Okay, that's where the Earth would be, and that is where the most time dilation would be occurring. Okay, therefore your galaxies, your stars, they would be up higher and higher and higher. They're the first to come out. Those events like supernovas and all these events that you see in the universe, yeah, they would have happened while the Earth is still in the gravitational time well. Therefore, yeah, we can measure those distances. We can get a relative idea of when those happened, but they would have all occurred due to gravitational time dilation. So I have no issue with the relative dates of when these events occurred, but I would just say they occurred at some point during the creation of the universe and the time. And one thing I want to point out, though, when you look into this, you'll find that it actually is consistent with Einstein physics and the theory of general relativity, because time dilations were, a good movie to watch is Interstellar. That kind of gets the mind. It's technical stuff. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on it? If you want to give some final thoughts on the flood portion and the radiometric dating, since you were my guest today, if you want, you can just take as much time as you want and kind of reflect on what we've talked about. Give some rebuttals if you want to the Starlight. Go ahead.
Sure. So I definitely want to take a look at the time dilation methods and stuff like that. I definitely want to look into them a little bit. I definitely think this has been a very good discussion, and I'm definitely looking forward to having our formal debate. Just out of curiosity, when we actually do our formal debate on this topic, do you want to do just radiometric dating and other dating methods, just Noah's flood, or do you kind of want to separate these two topics into two different debates?
No, let's I like to be as open as possible. I don't like to sneak up on anybody. So the arguments I used today regarding the flood, radiometric dating, Starlight, these are all the same arguments that I've been using. They're the same arguments I'll use for our debate. A more formal debate, if you'd like, with opening statements, rebuttals, Q&A. Therefore, we can do the same thing we did today: a debate on Noah's flood, a debate on dating methods, and I'm just going to use, for the most part, the same. I'm pretty confident with the arguments anyways. I have looked at rebuttals to what I'm saying, so when you research it, you'll come up with some good rebuttals, and then I'll have counter rebuttals, and it'll be a lot of good stuff for you to research, David. But I would say yes, all of them, because guess what? I said it before, that accelerated nuclear decay there's only two events in history that it could have possibly happened: the flood and creation. Therefore, they are so intertwined that it's almost impossible, and you'll probably agree with this, it's almost impossible to have a dating method debate without talking about the flood. You know what I mean?
Right. And vice versa.
Exactly. So anytime we discuss those topics again in the future, we'll discuss them all. All.
Definitely. And
do you want to have some final words?
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Well, let me see. Not really. The last little bit there, you asked some good questions. Starlight's a very technical one to answer, and the so-called heat problem. So I'm kind of winded, and I didn't get adamant with the questions. But what I will say is, tomorrow, guys, 2 p.m. EST, be here for the debate with Paul Price and Dr. Ron Garrett, and be there as well for David Neff's debate with Kent at 7:30 Central, David?
Yep. And again, that'll be up on my channel a little bit later. So expect that to come up on my channel around 11 p.m., 12 a.m.-ish. Definitely, it'll be up tomorrow sometime.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, David. You being my guest here yet again. I'm going to give you some final words. You can plug in whatever you want in 1 second. Thanks to the audience. Thanks for joining. Hope you enjoyed the discussion tonight. I think we touched on a lot of good topics that aren't always discussed in debates and discussions. So I think this was a lot of fun. And thanks so much, guys. Oh, and David, any last words as a final closing remark before we call it a night?
No final remarks, but once again, thank you so much for having me. I always love talking with you. You're always very respectful and very knowledgeable, and I hope you find the same way with me.
I do. And I've said it before. I enjoy the way that you come forth with some of the more challenging arguments and questions, which results in a good, fruitful debate and discussion. So once again, David, thanks so much. I appreciate your diligence and your research and your
Yeah,
study. And I look forward to your debate tomorrow with Kent. So,
yeah, definitely. Anyway, thank you so much.
okay. Thank you, David. We'll hand it over to Brother Matt, the man himself, the man with the plan, Matt, to shut her down.